when we think about July 4th, I think it's easy for us to kind of think about, why are we celebrating this holiday? Well, in one word, could sum it up: rebellion. Rebellion by the American colonists against the British government. And not only did they rebel in a very negative way, I think we can argue that they rebelled in a constructive way. Think about who became our first president. Why, it was none other than George Washington. And it wasn't because he was so honest with his cherry tree. It was ultimately because he was so wonderful about claiming the title president and deciding that he wasn't going to stay in office forever. In fact, he decided he was going to limit his term and do so with respect, so that there would be a smooth transition of authority for those coming after him. But as we know, not all rebellions are created equal. Some rebellions are more destructive than other rebellions. And in case we want to look at only modern history, I would advise us that we can do so by looking at a long time ago history. There's a story that we read every single year in the Torah about a very negative rebellion. It was a guy named Korach, and he was not depicted well in the Jewish commentary. In fact, he is described as an outright villain. And we have to ask ourselves, was he so villainous? What in fact did Korach do that was just so challenging to Moses' authority and the sanctity of the community that the rabbis felt compelled to describe somebody villainous? Well, we have to remember that in the book of Exodus, or when the Israelites were not in Egypt, but exiting Egypt and coming into the wilderness, they were identified as a kingdom of priests. And Korach held on to this concept. He wanted to see himself not as simply a leader, but that he could be, well, like Aaron or the Levites, special, above others. Just a reminder that there are wonderful examples in leadership, even in the book of Exodus. We see that Joshua ben Nun is being groomed by Moses to take over. We see that Bezalel is being charged with building the tabernacle and really congregating everybody together in an inspirational way. I point that out because, well, not all depictions of leadership in the Bible are negative. And yet, when we look at Korach, there was something that he did. Well, he spoke up against Moses. He wanted power. Nachmanides writes that the Israelites left Egypt, and Korach craved power. At each step of the way, he thought, is this the time for me to come up? Nope. The golden calf happened, people died, and Korach waited. He waited as people complained about the food, according to Nachmanides. He waited until the story of the spies, when there was already tension, when it was clear that there was going to be a generation of people who weren't going to get into the land, his generation specifically, when there already was some dissension. And at that perfect moment, he capitalized on the existent dissension within the community. And that's when he went and charged Moses. And he charged Moses very specifically, according to Nachmanides. Nachmanides is a mystic, and he believed that the Torah was a gift, but it was a screen, because God's power was through the word of God. And when you hear and experience it, it's so much for all of us. We need to have our concrete materialistic world so that we can withstand the power of God. And for Nachmanides, he explains that really what Korach was after was the ability to control the Torah, the ability to control the earth, the ability to control ultimately the narrative. And his punishment, why the earth opened up and ate Korach, guaranteeing that Korach understood that he couldn't rewrite the narrative, and he wasn't entitled to choosing his words in that moment. A second very famous midrash tells of a different reason of why Korach was really difficult for Moses. And it presents this imaginary conversation that the two of them are debating the kashrut of whether a specific talis was blue or all blue with the tzitzit, the strings, why the string, oh my goodness. Or a mezuzah, do you need a mezuzah in a house that's got lots of Torahs in it? And you can really imagine, you've got this guy finding just the minutia things to nitpick Moses about. And Moses responds to Korach, you're already special, Korach. You already are carrying the ark for us. You already have a role in our community. Why are you coming up and trying to capture and take over something that's not your space? And the Midrash goes on, the voice of the Midrash teaches that Korach, and they play with the Hebrew word lakach, took in his heart this envy and jealousy, and it carried him away into believing that he was in fact entitled to more than only carrying the ark, but that he was entitled to all sorts of things beyond what he was already promised and privileged to do. In the first story we looked at, we have this idea of somebody wanting to control a narrative. In the second one, we see the Korach's creating drama by depicting what he's entitled to. And I'll give you a modern example from Rabbi Soloveitchik, an Orthodox rabbi who went on to be the president at YU for a while, that he compares Korach and the narrative of a group of people who approached Moses and they wanted to celebrate Passover. But there are rules about how you celebrate Passover. If you are impure when it's time for Passover offering to be offered, then you can't go in the temple. And they felt saddened by not being able to participate. And so they came with humility at a proper time, made an appointment, and asked Moses, can there be some way that they can talk, that he can speak to God on their behalf? And Moses said, sure. And God came up with a holiday of Passover Sheni, or second Passover, which is in fact still in the Jewish calendar and celebrated 1 month after Passover. So in case you ever see that on the calendar, now you know why it's there. But Korach, on the other hand, didn't do what the people who requested Passover Sheni did. Korach and his followers instead came up and challenged Moses. And he did so, according to Soloveitchik, in a very sneaky way. He and his followers refused to admit that Moses had authority to determine what the rule of Torah was. He said that we only need to follow common sense to determine what the rule of Torah is. We can kind of extrapolate what Soloveitchik was saying. What he was arguing was that Moses had the understanding and special knowledge of a rabbi and a scholar, and that the rabbi and the scholar could therefore educate and lead the community in a specific format. What Soloveitchik was saying was that you don't need that. He was arguing that you could study at YouTube Community College or TikTok High School or maybe even Facebook University and use your common sense and therefore determine what was science and math and authority and power. We can see where Soloveitchik may have been wandering off into. I think it's important for when we think about Korach's rebellion, that Korach thought he knew more than he did, especially for Soloveitchik. And so we see that Korach's rebellion could have been about entitlement, could have been about power and authority. It could have even been about determining how we make decisions or where that correct information lies in the decision-making process. But what we see is that the American Revolution was ultimately a revolution that began with giving a voice to the voiceless, by respecting authority, at least when we look at the founding fathers, for one another. Even though John Adams and Thomas Jefferson may have been at each other's throats at various moments in time, they still lovingly respected one another and were praiseworthy that the other existed. When we think about how they were focused on making sure that people in the margins were still heard, we realize that the American rebellion had profound redeeming qualities. And sometimes we have to learn about how great something is by looking at how something like Korach's rebellion is absent from those good things. Let's think of that when we celebrate July 4th this weekend. May it be a fun weekend full of fireworks, hot dogs and hamburgers, and maybe a little bit of 4th of July song. May you have a wonderful 4th.